This is a production of Cornell University.
Okay, so the brief I got was to talk a little bit about how trees deal with drought and waterlogging. And I suppose from that first slide, you might guess that I have a little bit of an urban bias. And, you know, both of these subjects are rather broad and in their own right. So I hope to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the work that I've done in this area. I hope that we're amongst friends and we can all agree that trees enrich our lives through a whole range of different ways, of course, socially, emotionally, physically, economically in some cases. But I think when we're talking about the urban forest, we can acknowledge that there are some fairly strategic challenges coming up. Perhaps the urban forest can be visualized at the moment as a sort of, you know, pool of trees that might be performing somewhat well, but with the pressures created as a result of climate change, and certainly a whole range of pests and pathogens that are having their migration accelerated through climate change, they also pose rather significant pressures on the urban forest. And so we get that population of trees shifting into sort of the realms of poor performance and ultimately through to tree mortality. So there's a whole range of sort of challenges that I think we need to be aware of if we're interested in managing trees within the urban realm. Of course, when it comes to the acquisition of water, urban trees not only have to deal with the presence of, if you like, climatic drought, the lack of rainfall that might be brought about through climate change, but it also has to deal with issues such as soil compaction. So this tree here may well look like it's got a rather extensive volume of soil to exploit, but much of that soil will be compacted to such a high degree that the tree roots won't be able to establish within that volume of soil. And so the real volume of soil that tree will have is likely to be much, much lower than what you might think. And of course, soil volume matters. This photo taken by Johann Osberg shows that, you know, those internal trees, which were presumably planted at the same time as the marginal trees, are performing really quite differently. They're much, much smaller soil volumes, probably in isolated pits, mean that the size is really reduced. And a lot of that is down to availability of water and soil volume more generally. And see, those marginal trees do have some shared resources, so they have much more extensive soil volumes and they're performing much better as a result. Of course, some trees seem to be able to cope with almost no soil volumes. These are in fig trees in Hong Kong, and they can sort of stick themselves to the wall. So we shouldn't assume that every tree can behave like that. In actual fact, even those trees probably are rooted into like a cavity wall section, so they probably have a little bit more soil volume than meets the eye. Well, impermeable surfaces also of course have a lot of influence over the way that trees can access water. And this is a site in southern Sweden. These trees are 30 or 40 years old, but they look probably half that age. And of course, when you're planting into tarmac like that, it's little wonder that they don't perform terribly well. In fact, I'm amazed that they're surviving at all. So we have this sort of interaction between the extent of the soil and the volume of the soil and the climate. And this little escarpment in North Wales, I think, shows that quite nicely. We can see that those trees in the center that are on the sort of steepest parts of the slope have the poorest quality soil, are suffering most extensively from the drought in that particular year. And those trees around the margins, higher up on the escarpment where the the soil might be just that little bit thicker, and then of course lower down on the field margin where they have access to much more soil, we see that the trees are doing much better. So understanding those thresholds for damage is really important if we're to take that information and apply it in plant selection literature and decisions. So I suppose a key question that we would want to ask ourselves is, how do trees cope with that limited water availability? And so a scheme that I think is helpful to look at is the avoidance of a particular water deficit and the tolerance of a water deficit. And they're really the two major ways in which trees can deal with that stress. Of course, some plants could be said to escape water deficits altogether if they have very short life cycles, but of course, trees are perennial, so they can either avoid it or tolerate it. And the avoidance is largely brought about either by maximizing the acquisition of water or by reducing the water use. And I like to think of it as sort of three major themes in terms of the way in which trees can do that. So we have some physiological, some structural, or you might call them morpho-anatomical, or life cycle approaches to achieving those ends. So in terms of maximizing water acquisition, well, the hydraulic conductivity, particularly within the roots, for example, can be increased. That's been evidenced in some cases. But perhaps most significantly in trees in their natural environments is the deep rooting ability of some trees. And indeed, in savannas, we have found trees with roots over 60 meters deep. So this ability to be able to root very deeply means that you can decouple the precipitation on the surface from the experience of the tree in terms of its water deficit. Because if the trees can root down into aquifers underneath the surface and deep water channels, then as I say, they can remove the need for precipitation for much of the year. Of course, the other way to avoid that water deficit building up is to reduce water use. And they do that primarily through things like stomatal closure at a physiological level. At a structural level, there can be some increased resistance to leaf water loss, reduction in leaf and stem growth, reducing the demand from the crown for water. But also from a life cycle approach, we have leaf phenology, whereby we have drought deciduous plants, particularly in Mediterranean climates, of course, where the period of peak stress, if you like, for the tree is during the summer drought. And so trees will lose leaves during that period. And ultimately, of course, leaf abscission can be a way to avoid the deficit as well. From a urban point of view, though, I think it's right, we're interested much more so in the tolerance of water deficits, and things like osmotic adjustment and the turgor loss point are really important to understand if we're to understand how tolerant trees may be to the water deficits. And lastly, the resistance to drought-induced cavitation or embolism is important. And again, some of these things we can quantify quite precisely. So they're important characteristics to look at. I suppose a good place to start is to say, well, avoid the avoiders for challenging sites. We look at this Himalayan birch stuck in a sort of cubic meter of soil, and this is early August. It should be in full leaf and doing really, really nicely. But of course, the leaves have been shed to reduce the demand of the crown for water. And so this is surely not what the landscape architect would have wanted or designed into that particular scheme. Other relatively sensitive trees, even if they're established in continuous soil trenches and in rather, pretty good conditions under drought can demonstrate quite significant leaf apposition. So we see on the right-hand image there that the lime trees shedding their leaves. This is in early July. Again, they should be absolutely in full leaf and doing well, but extensive leaf shedding as a result of drought, and it sort of could almost be autumn underneath that particular avenue. Yet, if we turn around 180 degrees, what we see along the same avenue is a different species, in this case, Norway maple, that's doing rather well. So we know that there's quite a profound difference across species when it comes to drought tolerance, and these can make really meaningful differences when it comes to landscape performance as well. So, having looked at some of the outline schemes of how trees can cope with water deficits, perhaps a more applied question is, well, how can we select for drought tolerance? And we might take a look at the academic plant stress literature. Of course, things like Jacob Levitt's book is seminal in this area. Those of you that are watching with, how should we say, perhaps a little bit more experience, will be very familiar with this, I'm sure. More recently, of course, these sorts of texts are really important for our understanding of plant stress. But the problem with these texts is, while they're brilliant in terms of identifying mechanisms and outlining some of the science, they tend not to do a lot of comparative work evaluating different species. When we take plant use literature, of course, they almost go the other way. They try to take very broad views of different species, but don't always do that terribly precisely. So the challenge is, how do we interpret advice from this sort of literature? Because if we take a single species, this Acer here, box elder, or sometimes called, Crossman would say useful for sandy, dry to sterile soil. Other sources would say drought tolerant, but yet it's native along streams and ponds, native in moist habitats, but performs well also in poor, wet or dry habitats. That's really sitting on the fence. Heat and drought tolerant, HISO, grows along shores of permanent bodies of water, likes humid areas, grows along stream banks, floodplains and swamps. So if you look at a single species from the plant use literature, you can get a kind of a whole range of mixed messages, and that's quite problematic when it comes to giving good advice to plant users. There's meta-analysis in ecological literature, and this is a particularly good one from Ulla Ninemitz and Valadares, where, as well as doing a big meta-analysis, they provide supplementary information with about 800 species and rank them according to their drought, shade and waterlogging tolerance. So that's where a whole range of ecological literature has been reviewed and sort of synthesized, and that's really, really helpful. But of course, I should just explain the table here. This is their drought tolerance ranking. They have a scale ranking of 1 to 5, and essentially it goes from very wet areas of annual precipitation through to dry, with corresponding increases in variation in terms of when the precipitation is distributed in the year, the precipitation to potential evapotranspiration moving from rather high to very low, and so on. So you get effectively a gradient that's backed up by some quantitative numbers in terms of the drought tolerance, and it's all based on tree survivorship within those areas. And the problem is, when we look at the sort of more ecological literature, is I think there has to be a question mark over how relevant it is always to the urban environment, because if we place trees that have a propensity for deep rooting in an urban environment above a car park or something like that, then of course we've removed their ability to deep root away. And so therefore they're having to rely on other mechanisms which just may not be there for their drought tolerance. And so the question, is, does survival in the environment equal performance in our urban landscapes? And so trying to resolve how we can take some of these things forward, we've started to look at a more trait-based assessment, and that's a quantifiable characteristic that can reveal something of the tree's personality, if you like. And two particular traits of interest are the leaf turgor loss point and the stem water potential at 50% loss of hydraulic conductivity. I'm probably only going to talk a little bit about the turgor loss point in this presentation, but please do ask me about the loss of hydraulic conductivity in the questions if you're particularly interested in that. So the leaf turgor loss point is quite a well-established physiological measure of drought tolerance, and Megan Bartlett has done some really good analysis of these turgor loss points across the literature. And the method that we've used, and I say we, myself, a colleague, Henrik Huaman, who was doing a postdoc at Cornell with Nina several years ago now, we used this technique that was sort of established by Megan Bartlett and her colleagues to effectively measure the osmotic potential at full turgor, and then you apply a regression equation to that osmotic potential at full turgor to estimate the leaf turgor loss point. And when you take the data that's been published, and that's actually it's a reanalysis of some of Megan Bartlett's data. Megan Bartlett had a global data set, and we sort of reanalyzed just the Mediterranean and temperate species. And we got a slightly better relationship, R squared of 0.91. So we used that relationship to predict our leaf turgor loss point from the osmotic potential at full turgor. And then, of course, once we have that, we can rank species according to their drought tolerance. And so I'm just going to talk through a little bit of a case study on that. I should say, prior to this new technique using the osmometer, you'd use probably pressure volume curves would be the most widely used technique to establish these sorts of relationships. And we've actually since looked at the PV technique versus the VAPRO, which is a Westcore instrument, and the WP4C, which is a Decagon instrument that effectively use similar techniques. And we can see that actually the osmometers are much more sensitive to osmotic potential and therefore predicting the leaf turgor loss point than the pressure volume curves. And this was a study done by colleague Jonathan Banks and myself on Acers. So back to Cornell and Henrik Huaman's postdoctoral work there with Nina. We selected Acer because we understood them to be quite variable in their tolerance to drought. And so using the collections at Cornell, Henrik evaluated the leaf turgor loss of about 26 Acer species, both in the spring and the summer. So we had some indication of seasonal adjustment of the turgor loss. And so the figure that you're looking at there shows the species we evaluated, and they're ranked according to their summer turgor loss point. So the most negative, of course, turgor loss is most drought tolerant. So we see right the way Acer spicatum going right down to Acer mons specialanum. And what we found was that obviously there were really substantive differences across that data set. And things like Acer spicatum that grow in the humid understory, they had a turgor loss point of about minus 1.6 megapascals. Acer truncatum that would naturally grow in an environment like this, in the Qingling Mountains in China. They had a turgor point of -2.4 megapascals. Remember, the data that we're getting is all from the trees in the botanical collection around Cornell University. So we haven't gone to their native sites. These are all effectively in the same botanical collection. Acer tataricum, though, which would ordinarily grow in the steppes of eastern Romania, had a turgor point of -3.6 megapascals. Acer grandidentatum in west coast of the western sort of slopes of the Rockies predominantly. That was around -3.8 megapascals, and Acer montpecillanum, that was even more negative than that, was around -4. And we established that you could pick up differences in drought tolerance in cultivars. So Acer saccharum and Acer rubrum, we tested multiple cultivars, and there were differences that were statistically significant amongst those as well. And so if you took your little planting beds, in this case, this is actually a picture of downtown Ithaca, so I guess you will recognize this. Whether or not these trees are still there, I don't know. But if you took our scheme and say, well, okay, we're going to take those species with a high turgor loss point and try and put them in these rather constrained coffins, if you like, urban soil coffins, then they're not going to work terribly well. But if you take a species with a much lower, more negative turgor loss point, I'm not saying that those species that are circled would be appropriate, but if, as a general idea, if you take the more negative turgor loss species, they're going to be able to cope much more effectively with more extensive soil drying and so on. So since that initial case study, we've done probably about 200 species now. So we have quite a good range of species, good range of genre, and we're able to put a sort of framework around it. And so what we've started looking at for our plant guidance and plant use guidance is using sort of thresholds of the turgor loss point to allocate a qualitative drought tolerance. So for example, anything that's less than it's higher than -2.5 megapascals, we're calling drought sensitive. Between -2.5 and 3, we're calling moderately sensitive. Between 3 and -3.5, moderately tolerant, and then more negative than -3.5 tolerant, so that we can begin to put some numbers behind our qualitative terms, because so much of the plant use literature is just kind of personal interpretations and so on, and that's okay to an extent. But if we can try and underpin some of these qualitative terms with quantitative plant data, then that's really helpful, I think. And so since we've got these rather large data sets now, we've been able to most recently done some sort of analysis at the genre level, and we show that Magnolia, Betula, they're really sensitive as a genre compared with groups like Acer and Quercus, and then lots of kind of other genre sort of sit in the middle somewhere. But it's quite helpful to think about that, and of course it's really important to look at the individual species as well. But we can see some tendencies, that magnolias, at least of the 31 species we've measured, have all been really rather sensitive to drought. So understanding this is quite important. And then if we evaluate the turgor loss point that we've been measuring against tolerance scales like the Nindimetz and Valadares scale, we can see that although there's not a great predictive value there, there's a clear decrease in the turgor loss point when the ecological drought tolerance scale is increasing. So again, this is all quite helpful supporting information. And we've been able to integrate this into professional guidance. This is something that came out of a project a year or so ago now, but this is some digital guidance that you can download for free from an organization called the Trees and Design Action Group, which is www.tdag.org.uk, and you can go and you can download a file and an associated database from that site, and it has about 280 profiles, of which there's various items of information that you would expect in a plant use in plant use guidance. Of course, some of which is the drought tolerance work, and wherever possible, we've underpinned those drought tolerance scores with quantitative trait data. But what we've done is interpret that for the reader, so that you're not presenting landscape architects or horticulturalists necessarily with a turgor loss value. You're presenting them with something that would indicate whether it's moderately tolerant or moderately sensitive, so that it becomes usable from their point of view, but hopefully as evidence-based as it possibly can be. And one of the things that we look at doing is in this guidance is to identify particular use potentials. And so, for example, the paved sites all have a moderate tolerance to drought allocated to them. So those species that we're recommending for paved environments have this moderate tolerance to drought, or they're tolerant to drought. And so that just helps, justify why we think those species are particularly useful for that paved environment. I'm aware that the title of this slide suggested that we were going to look at waterlogging tolerance as well, and so I also wanted to talk a little bit about SUDS, what we call sustainable drainage systems. And of course, that involves a degree of waterlogging tolerance. And so while it's important that we have traits that look at drought tolerance, when we're evaluating waterlogging tolerance, it's really rather different. So again, ideally we'd have some sort of scheme, from sensitive to tolerant, but trying to get a handle on how we might allocate different species to a scheme like this is much more challenging than it is for drought, actually. And that's partly because flooding and, if you like, waterlogging is a really complex stress. So there's variation in response according to growing season, flooding depth, duration of flooding, time since last flood, so the recovery time since last flood. And there's a whole range of metabolic effects that can come into play. So it's quite challenging to really quantitatively measure waterlogging tolerance in a way that we can do quite readily through turgor loss or the loss of hydraulic conductance with the drought. So one of the things that we've been trying to develop is a more quantitative way to evaluate waterlogging tolerance. And so what I turned to was sap flow. Why? Because it provides continuous data, or more or less continuous data. So we have something around every 10 minutes having a data set for that. And it's sensitive to the atmospheric conditions, of course, and as well as the edaphic conditions. So it integrates the root system and the crown really rather nicely. So you can see here the VPD, the vapor pressure deficit, and versus the sap velocity, and this is actually in some Prunus maackii. And you can see where it's cool, has high relative humidity and it rains, we get depressed sap velocities. Where it's relatively warm, low relative humidity, much higher sap velocities. And you can see the really incredible association between the vapor pressure deficit and the sap velocity. So I should just explain, every peak represents a day, and you can see the upright grey bars there, they're the night time. So you can see these oscillations between day sap flow and much, much lower or zero sap flow at night. And so I used this technique, and I took a range of species, and I'll just share 3 with you. This is Prunus maackii. It's a type of cherry that's native to Siberia. And when we impose a waterlogging stress on it, you can see that very rapidly that waterlogging treatment departs from the control treatment. So there's n equals 6 here, and the grey banding represents the standard error. So you can see you get a decline really rather rapidly with the waterlogging period. And then when I drained the containers, actually that doesn't get any worse, but it sticks at around the 50% level, if that makes sense. And so we flooded them, we drained them. At peak stress, there was no no visible differences between those 2 treatments. They looked exactly the same, yet there was massive differences occurring to the sap flow. And if we look at sap flow versus the photosynthesis and somatal conductance, we see that very rapidly we get a decline in photosynthesis and somatal conductance in that waterlogging period, and then even during the drained period, certainly after the first week, the gas exchange hadn't really recovered to any great extent. If we look at another species, Acer platanoides, this is again the daily sap flow, so you can see the peaks and troughs going on with that. It's waterlogged, and very, very rapidly we see this decline in sap flow in the waterlog treatment. And you can again see at peak waterlogging stress no difference at all in the visible symptoms. When we drained it, though, I was quite surprised to see that actually what happened was they totally defoliated. And yeah, by the end, you can see that such massive differences in sap flow as a result of the waterlogged trees having totally defoliated, and they lost their leaves and therefore their demand for water from the roots. So we can see there the Acer platanoides very sensitive to waterlogging, and the photosynthesis and somatal conductance absolutely crashed as a result. So let's contrast this to a species that should be tolerant to waterlogging, Salix alba. So this is a white willow. I'm sure you have plenty of tolerant willows. And you can see during that waterlogging phase, there is really rather minor differences between the 2 treatment groups. That day rained a lot, so you can see almost no sap flow on that day. And then when we drained, again, we don't really see any profound differences between the treatments. It was a bit dark and wet while I did this, and the sensors were on solar panels, so that's why we lost about a day's worth of data there. But you get the idea. That much less response from the tolerant species to the sensitive species. So again, we waterlogged, and although we did pick up a reduction in photosynthesis and somatal conductance after a week's waterlogging, within the following week after being drained, there was no difference whatsoever in the treatment groups. One of the reasons that, of course, willow is waterlogging tolerant is the presence of hypertrophied lenticels, and you could see those clearly developing underneath the waterline, and that, of course, helps to ventilate the root system, and is one of the reasons why Salix are pretty tolerant to waterlogging. So from that study, I think we were able to demonstrate that sap flow could be used as a tool to evaluate waterlogging tolerance. There seemed to be at least three, but possibly more responses to the sap flow. One, relatively no response really. A decline in sap flow throughout the waterlogging period, and then sort of stabilizing upon drainage, and then a decline throughout the waterlogging period, and then a continued decline after draining, probably as a result of what we would call post-anoxic stress, whereby the root system is reoxygenated, and that can release a lot of toxins. And it seems that Acer platanoides was particularly susceptible to that because it lost its leaves. Of course, photosynthesis and somatical inductance are also very sensitive to waterlogging, and basically visual analysis is useless for identifying this particular stress because in all cases, although we could see profound physiological changes in sap flow and gas exchange, visually there was really very little to choose between the different treatments. So I think that's an important message for us as applied scientists. If you're out inspecting trees, if there have been waterlogging events, there may be some profound things going on that you just can't pick up visually. So I would hope then, in terms of the future of tree selection, we would be able to provide a little bit more foresight. And one of the ways which we can do that is by collecting data through plant traits and integrating that more effectively into our plant selection literature. And that's going to be really important for providing climate resilience and sort of biosecurity as well. Integrate much more evidence-based approaches and focus on landscape performance, not just on landscape aesthetic. And I think that's going to be really key as we move forward into more challenging times. And hopefully, we can support and enable scientists to carry out some of this work and translate knowledge so that it doesn't just stay in the academic realm. Some of this knowledge really gets out into the landscape and professional plant use communities, because of course it's not much good unless it does that. So I think that's probably where I want to leave it in terms of what I've got to say. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I think that's not a million miles away.
You're doing fine.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time listening.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. We have a little time, got about 10 minutes. If people have questions, just say unmute and question away.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for this interesting talk. I was wondering, with your treatments of flooding, is a 1 week time period, where did you come up with that number? Is that something that you've seen in cities that get flooded, or it was kind of arbitrary?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Where did I come up with that number? Well, I guess the project was geared around trying to get a better handle on which species would be good for these sustainable drainage systems. And of course, they're basically designed to flood regularly, but probably for relatively short periods of time during the season, because they'll drain very, very rapidly as well. So I just, I picked a week because I felt it would be long enough for those that are really sensitive to show something, but not sufficiently difficult to sort of do several species in any 1 year. I only had, one of it's just practical reasons really. I only had 12 sap flow sensors at the time, and I wanted to sort of rotate a number of different species over the course of the growing season. And so sort of had a, week's kind of recovery, week's stress treatment, just to sort of keep things moving. So there's so much more work you could do experimenting with different times, durations of flooding, short regular flooding periods or very extended flooding periods. But I just, it was quite exploratory in that sense. So I just sort of, just went for a week, and that's what happened. Yeah. Sorry, I can't be more kind of scientific than that, but that was basically the decision.
Makes total sense. Thank you.
So Andrew, I wonder also about the flooding in terms of the seasonality of flooding. when it happens. I mean, because there are normal floodplain species that get flooded in the spring and do fine. But when you do the flooding in the summer or later summer, they don't do as well. And so I wondered if you thought about the seasonality of flooding.
Well, again, seasonality definitely does make a big difference when it comes to the species responses. Lots of things can cope quite well with winter waterlogging, but and summer waterlogging poses a much more significant problem to them. And as you say, some can cope well with the spring flooding because they're used to dealing with snow melt or whatever it might be, and more seasonal watercourses. I think all that work is yet to be done. So if somebody wants to look at that, that would be fantastic. I suppose to say what I was hoping to do was just demonstrate that sap flow could be a useful tool to evaluate the sensitivity to flooding, because it sort of integrates so many other signals.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Challenging study.
Nina, can I ask a question?
Sure, Lai.
Hey, Andrew, really enjoyed your seminar. The work on waterlogging is really interesting. It's very obvious that sap flow can be used as an indicator here, but when you compared with just traditional gas exchange, when you use sap flow, you have to take the tree canopy size into consideration. So if these two trees are quite different in size, that will be reflected in the sap flow, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, these were all the trees that I used were all supplied at the same size and the same soil volume. Mm-hmm. And I had sort of n equals 6, which is, believe it or not, is relatively good for sap flow studies. Often you just get 1 or 2 replicates, because there is, absolutely, there's variation according to from tree to tree, and that is important to acknowledge. And if I plotted individual trees out rather than the mean, you see that variation. So it's important to have sufficient replication to be able to deal with that. But it's good. It's a good point. You definitely have to acknowledge that. And if you were doing it, I suppose, in the field, you'd need to, in a sort of natural site, that would be much more challenging to control for. But I just had the same size trees from a nursery, so there was variation, but perhaps less. I mean, the other way you can get variation is just sort of installation artifacts. These sensors aren't absolutely foolproof for sure, so you can get installation artifacts and things like that will kind of artificially skew some data. Yeah. So it's not bulletproof, but I think if done carefully, it's quite a useful technique.
Yeah, and it gives you the whole tree picture.
Yeah, exactly. Because
that's what I really like.
Yeah, I mean, you saw how well it sort of mapped up to the vapor pressure deficit.
Yes.
That was really very closely related. Every little sort of peak and trough could be related to changes in vapor pressure deficit, and that's the other thing. You need to have a handle on what's going on atmospherically and with a control group, because there's so much variation across sap flow. Unless you understood those things, you couldn't hope to say that it's down to a treatment effect.
Yep. Thank you. I do have another question, Andrew.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little more on the method you used to determine the water potential at loss of turgor? Because I remember Tom Whitlow was using, in the old days, spending a lot of time doing PV curves and things like that. But the method you developed and you have used is obviously a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so I should say I didn't develop the technique. It was Megan Bartlett's. I thought this is a rather handy technique because PV curves, anyone that's done them will probably have a love-hate relationship with them because they're extremely time-consuming, or can be. And so what the technique that we did, we went out and to the collections, we harvested relatively small shoots from different individual replicates, and then we would recut underwater so that we removed any sort of embolism as a result of taking the initial cut. And then we would rehydrate overnight in a dark, cool chamber with very high relative humidity, so that the leaves, or the shoots, I should say, were back at full turgor, because otherwise you have effects as a result of relative water content.
Yes.
And so after that, we would then take like a hole punch, effectively, take a small leaf disc and place that into the osmometer, and the osmometer then takes a value which you convert into the water potential. These things are designed for looking at bloods and urines and so on in hospital, but they effectively do the job. So it was basically harvesting shoots, rehydrating overnight. Oh, sorry, I missed out the stage. We had to flash freeze in liquid nitrogen in order to remove the turgor pressure element, so that the water potential that was being measured in the leaf disc was only relating to the osmotic potential, not a combination of osmotic and turgor potential. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, Lai Lang, we Brandon and I are doing work with that. So anytime you want to come by and see what we're doing with the osmotic potential with the vapor pressure osmometer, let's get together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nina.
I'm just wondering what tree species you expect to see more of in the future urban planning and environments.
Well, I don't know. I think probably a greater focus on the more drought tolerant species would be certainly there. So I think about the things like the Acer mompesilanum, which was shown to be very drought tolerant and is almost exactly the same as something that gets Acer campestri, which gets planted very, very widely over here, and is in some ways a continuation of the Acer campestri population into sort of Central Europe. I think shifting from Acer campestri to Acer mompesilanum, things like that, we'll see little nudges where as landscape the general public probably won't notice much difference, but there'll be tweaks to the species profiles that will mean they're slightly more drought tolerant. I think there's lots of sort of examples like that which you could point to. And of course, diversity in species is also going to be really important, with that diversity coming from the more stress tolerant species. But I guess it will depend a lot on where you are, what's available in the nurseries around you and so on. And I'm sure Nina's got lots of other examples that she could offer you.
Yeah, I love Acer mompesilanum, but it's basically a big shrub.
Yeah, well, that is true. I think there is some work trying to get sort of more standard tree type mompesilanums. But you're right, yeah. And if you grow it from seeds, the chances are you're going to get a big shrub, yeah. So yeah, that's true. I think there are some tree forms that you can get from the German nurseries for sure.
Be worth looking at, yeah. Okay, if there's no more questions,
okay, well,
we will thank Andrew heartily for this fascinating seminar, and good to see you again, Andrew. And thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Well, thanks for all your time, and I appreciate you taking time out to sign in. And and if you want to follow up with me on a one-to-one, or you can send me an email. That's no problem at all.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.